Chapter 8. The Persecution of Zisca. The real name of this zealous servant of Christ was John de Truxnau. That of Zisca is a Bohemian word signifying one-eyed, as he had lost an eye. He was a native of Bohemia of a good family and left the court of Wenceslas to enter into the service of the King of Poland against the Teutonic Knights. Having obtained a badge of honor and a purse of ducats for his gallantry at the close of the war, he returned to the court of Wenceslas, to whom he boldly avowed the deep interest he took in the bloody affront offered to his Majesty's subjects at Constance in the affair of Huss. Wenceslas lamented it was not in his power to revenge it, and from this moment Zisca is said to have formed the idea of asserting the religious liberties of his country. In the year 1418, the council was dissolved, having done more mischief than good, and in the summer of that year a general meeting was held of the Friends of Religious Reformation at the castle of Wyszgrad, who, conducted by Zisca, repaired to the emperor with arms in their hands and offered to defend him against his enemies. The king bid them use their arms properly, and this stroke of policy first ensured to Zisca the confidence of his party. Wenceslas was succeeded by Sigismund, his brother, who rendered himself odious to the reformers and removed all such as were obnoxious to his government. Zisca and his friends upon this immediately flew to arms, declared war against the emperor and the pope, and laid siege to Pilsen with 40,000 men. They soon became masters of the fortress, and in a short time all the southwest part of Bohemia submitted, which greatly increased the army of the reformers. The latter having taken the pass of Moldau, after a severe conflict of 5 days and nights, the emperor became alarmed and withdrew his troops from the confines of Turkey to march them into Bohemia. At Bern and Moravia he halted and sent dispatches to treat of peace, as a preliminary to which Zisca gave up Pilsen and all the fortresses he had taken. Sigismund, proceeding in a manner that clearly manifested he acted on the Roman doctrine that no faith was to be kept with heretics, and treating some of the authors of the late disturbances with severity, the alarm bell of revolt was sounded from one end of Bohemia to the other. Zisca took the castle of Prague by the power of money, and on August the 19th, 1420, defeated the small army the emperor had hastily got together to oppose him. He next took Ostia by assault and destroyed the town with a barbarity that disgraced the cause in which he fought. Winter approaching, Zisca fortified his camp on a strong hill about 40 miles from Prague, which he called Mount Tabor, whence he surprised a body of horse at midnight and made 1,000 men prisoners. Shortly after, the emperor obtained possession of the strong fortress of Prague by the same means Zisca had done before. It was blockaded by the latter, and want began to threaten the emperor, who saw the necessity of a retreat. Determined to make a desperate effort, Sigismund attacked the fortified camp of Zisca on Mount Tabor and carried it with great slaughter. Many other fortresses also fell, and Zisca withdrew to a craggy hill, which he strongly fortified, and whence he so annoyed the emperor in his approaches against the town of Prague that he found he must either abandon the siege or defeat his enemy. The Marquis of Misnia was deputed to effect this with a larger body of troops, but the event was fatal to the imperialists. They were defeated, and the emperor, having lost nearly 1/3 of his army, retreated from the siege of Prague, harassed in his rear by the enemy. In the spring of 1421, Zisca commenced the campaign as before by destroying all the monasteries in his way. He laid siege to the castle of Wyszgrad, and the emperor, coming to relieve it, fell into a snare, was defeated with a dreadful slaughter, and this important fortress was taken. Our general had now leisure to attend the work of reformation, but he was much disgusted with the gross ignorance and superstition of the Bohemian clergy, who rendered themselves contemptible in the eyes of the whole army. When he saw any symptoms of uneasiness in the camp, he would spread alarm in order to divert them and draw his men into action. In one of these expeditions he encamped before the town of Ruby, and while pointing out the place for an assault, an arrow shot from the wall struck him in the eye. At Prague it was extracted, but being barbed, it tore the eye out with it. A fever succeeded, and his life was with difficulty preserved. He was now totally blind, but still desirous of attending the army. The emperor, having summoned the states of the empire to assist him, resolved with their assistance to attack Zisca in the winter, when many of his troops departed until the return of spring. The Confederate princes undertook the siege of Soissons, but at the approach merely of the Bohemian general, they retreated. Sigismund nevertheless advanced with his formidable army, consisting of 15,000 Hungarian horse and 25,000 infantry, well equipped for a winter campaign. This army spread terror through all the east of Bohemia. Wherever Sigismund marched, the magistrates laid their keys at his feet and were treated with severity or favor, according to their merits in his cause. Zisca, however, with speedy marches approached, and the emperor resolved to try his fortune once more with that invincible chief. On the 13th of January 1422, the two armies met on a spacious plain near Kremenz. Zisca appeared in the center of his front line, guarded, or rather conducted, by a horseman on each side, armed with a pole axe. His troops, having sung a hymn with a determined coolness, drew their swords and waited for a signal. When his officers had informed him that the ranks were all well closed, he waved his saber around his head, which was the sign of battle. This battle is described as a most awful sight. The extent of the plain was one continued scene of disorder. The imperial army fled towards the confines of Moravia, the Taborites without intermission galling their rear. The river Igla, then frozen, opposed their flight. The enemy pressing furiously, many of the infantry, and in a manner of the whole body of the cavalry, attempted the river. The ice gave way, and not fewer than 2,000 were swallowed up in the water. Zisca now returned to Tabor, laden with all the spoils and trophies which the most complete victory could give. Zisca now began again to pay attention to the Reformation. He forbid all the prayers for the dead, images, sacerdotal vestments, fasts, and festivals. Priests were to be preferred according to their merits, and no one to be persecuted for religious opinions. In everything Zisca consulted the liberal-minded, and did nothing without general concurrence. An alarming disagreement now arose at Prague between the magistrates who were Calixtans, or receivers of the sacraments in both kinds, and the Taborites, 9 of the chiefs of whom were privately arraigned and put to death. The populace, enraged, sacrificed the magistrates, and the affair terminated without any particular consequence. The Calixtans having sunk into contempt, Zisca was solicited to assume the crown of Bohemia, but this he nobly refused, and prepared for the next campaign, in which Sigismund resolved to make his last effort. While the Marquis of Misnia penetrated into Upper Saxony, the emperor proposed to enter Moravia on the side of Hungary. Before the Marquis had taken the field, Zisca sat down before the strong town of Aussig, situated on the Elbe. The Marquis flew to its relief with a superior army, and after an obstinate engagement was totally defeated, and Aussig capitulated. Zisca then went to the assistance of Prokop, a young general whom he had appointed to keep Sigismund in check, and whom he compelled to abandon the siege of Pernitz, after laying 8 weeks before it. Zisca, willing to give his troops some respite from fatigue, now entered Prague, hoping his presence would quell any uneasiness that might remain after the late disturbance. But he was soonly attacked by the people, and he and his troop, having beaten off the citizens, effected a retreat to his army, whom he acquainted with the treacherous conduct of the Calixtans. Every effort of address was necessary to appease their vengeful animosity, and at night, in a private interview between Rousing, an ecclesiastic of great eminence in Prague, and Zisca, the latter became reconciled, and the intended hostilities were done away. Mutually tired of the war, Sigismund sent to Zisca, requesting him to sheath his sword and name his conditions. A place of congress being appointed, Zisca, with his chief officers, set out to meet the emperor. Compelled to pass through a part of the country where the plague raged, he was seized with it at the castle of Brzka, and departed this life, October 6th, 1424. Like Moses, he died in view of the contemplation of his labors, and was buried in the great church of Sazla in Bohemia, where a monument is erected to his memory, with this inscription on it, quote, "Here lies John Zisca, who, having defended his country against the encroachments of papal tyranny, rests in his hallowed place, in despite of the Pope." End quote. After the death of Zisca, Prokop was defeated, and fell with the liberties of his country. After the death of Huss and Jerome, the Pope, in conjunction with the Council of Constance, ordered the Roman clergy everywhere to excommunicate such as adopted their opinions or commiserated their fate. These orders occasioned great contentions between the Papists and Reformed Bohemians, which was the cause of a violent persecution against the latter. At Prague, the persecution was extremely severe, until at length, the Reformed being driven to desperation, armed themselves, attacked the Senate House, and threw 12 senators with the Speaker out of the Senate House windows, whose bodies fell upon spears, which were held up by others of the Reformed in the street to receive them. Being informed of these proceedings, the Pope came to Florence and publicly excommunicated the Reformed Bohemians, exciting the Emperor of Germany and all kings, princes, dukes, etc., to take up arms in order to extirpate the whole race, and promising, by way of encouragement, full remission of all sins whatever to the most wicked person if he did but kill one Bohemian Protestant. This occasioned a bloody war, for several popish princes undertook the extirpation or at least expulsion of the proscribed people, and the Bohemians, arming themselves, prepared to repel force by force in the most vigorous and effectual manner. The popish army prevailing against the Protestant forces at the Battle of Kuttenberg, the prisoners of the Reformed were taken to 3 deep mines near that town, and several hundreds were cruelly thrown into each, where they miserably perished. A merchant of Prague, going to Breslau, in Silesia, happened to lodge in the same inn with several priests. Entering into conversation upon the subject of religious controversy, he passed many encomiums upon the martyr John Huss and his doctrines. The priest, taking umbrage at this, laid in information against him the next morning, and he was committed to prison as a heretic. Many endeavors were used to persuade him to embrace the Roman Catholic faith, but he remained steadfast to the pure doctrines of the Reformed Church. Soon after his imprisonment, a student of the university was committed to the same jail. When being permitted to converse with the merchant, they mutually comforted each other. On the day appointed for execution, when the jailer began to fasten the ropes to their feet, by which they were to be dragged through the streets, the student appeared quite terrified and offered to abjure his faith and turn Roman Catholic if he might be saved. The offer was accepted. His abjuration was taken by a priest, and he was set at liberty. A priest, applying to the merchant to follow the example of the student, he nobly said, quote, "Lose no time in hopes of my recantation. Your expectations will be in vain. I sincerely pity that poor wretch who has miserably sacrificed his soul for a few more uncertain years of a troublesome life, and so far from having the least idea of following his example, I glory in the very thoughts of dying for the sake of Christ." End quote. On hearing these words, the priest ordered the executioner to proceed, and the merchant, being drawn through the city, was brought to the place of execution, and there burnt. Pico, a bigoted popish magistrate, apprehended 24 Protestants, among whom was his daughter's husband. As they all owned they were of the Reformed religion, he indiscriminately condemned them to be drowned in the river Abyss. On the day appointed for the execution, a great concourse of people attended, among whom was Pico's daughter. This worthy wife threw herself at her father's feet, bedewed them with tears, and in the most pathetic manner implored him to commiserate her sorrow and pardon her husband. The obdurate magistrate sternly replied, quote, "Intercede not for him, child. He is a heretic, a vile heretic." End quote. To which she nobly answered, "Whatever his faults may be, or however his opinions may differ from yours, he is still my husband, a name which, at a time like this, should alone employ my whole consideration." Piquel flew into a violent passion and said, "You are mad. Cannot you, after the death of this, have a much worthier husband?" "No, sir," replied she. "My affections are fixed upon this, and the death itself shall not dissolve my marriage vow." Piquel, however, continued inflexible, and ordered the prisoners to be tied with their hands and feet behind them, and in that manner be thrown into the river. As soon as this was put into execution, the young lady watched her opportunity, leaped into the waves, and embracing the body of her husband, both sank together into one watery grave. An uncommon instance of conjugal love in a wife, and of an inviolable attachment to, and personal affection for, her husband. The Emperor Ferdinand, whose hatred to the Bohemian Protestants was without bounds, not thinking he had sufficiently oppressed them, instituted a high court of reformers upon the plan of the Inquisition, with this indifference, that the reformers were to remove from place to place and always be attended by a body of troops. These reformers consisted chiefly of Jesuits, and from their decision there was no appeal, by which it may be easily conjectured that it was a dreadful tribunal indeed. This bloody court, attended by a body of troops, made the tour of Bohemia, in which they seldom examined or saw a prisoner, suffering the soldiers to murder the Protestants as they pleased, and then to make a report of the matter to them afterward. The first victim of their cruelty was an aged minister, whom they killed as he lay in his sick bed, The next day they robbed and murdered another, and soon after shot a third as he was preaching in his pulpit. A nobleman and clergyman who resided in a Protestant village, hearing of the approach of the High Court of Reformers and the troops, fled from the place and secreted themselves. The soldiers, however, on their arrival, seized upon a schoolmaster, asked him where the lord of that place and the minister were concealed, and where they had hidden their treasures. The schoolmaster replied that he could not answer either of the questions. They then stripped him naked, bound him with cords, and beat him most unmercifully with cudgels. This cruelty not extorting any confession from him, they scorched him in various parts of his body. When to gain a respite from his torments, he promised to show them where the treasures were laid. The soldiers gave ear to this with pleasure, and the schoolmaster led them to a ditch full of stones, saying, "Beneath these stones are the treasures ye seek for." Eager after money, they went to work, and soon removed those stones, but not finding what they sought after, they beat the schoolmaster to death, buried him in the ditch, and covered him with the very stones he had made them to remove. Some of the soldiers ravished the daughters of a worthy Protestant before his face, and then tortured him to death. A minister and his wife they tied to the back and burnt. Another minister they hung upon a crossbeam, and making a fire under him, broiled him to death. A gentleman they hacked into small pieces, and they filled a young man's mouth with gunpowder, and setting fire to it, blew his head to pieces. As their principal rage was directed against the clergy, they took a pious Protestant minister, and tormenting him daily for a month together in the following manner, making their cruelty regular, systematic, and progressive. They placed him amidst them, and made him the subject of their derision and mockery, during a whole day's entertainment, trying to exhaust his patience, but in vain, for he bore the whole with true Christian fortitude. They spit in his face, pulled his nose, and pinched him in most parts of his body. He was hunted like a wild beast until ready to expire with fatigue. They made him run the gauntlet between two ranks of them, each striking him with a twig. He was beat with ropes. They scourged him with wires. He was beat with cudgels. They tied him up by the heels with his head downwards until the blood started out of his nose, mouth, etc. They hung him by the right arm until it was dislocated, and then had it set again. The same was repeated with his left arm. He was bastinadoed on his feet. A slit was made in his right ear. The same repeated on his left ear. His nose was slit. They whipped him through the town upon an ass. They made several incisions in his flesh. They pulled off the toenails of his right foot. The same they repeated with his left foot. A knotted cord was twisted about his forehead in such a manner as to force out his eyes. During the whole of these horrid cruelties, particular care was taken that his wounds should not mortify, and not to injure him mortally until the last day, when the forcing out of his eyes proved his death. Innumerable were other murders and depredations committed by those unfeeling brutes, and shocking to humanity were the cruelties which they inflicted on the poor Bohemian Protestants. The winter being far advanced, however, the High Court of Reformers, with their infernal band of military ruffians, thought proper to return to Prague. But on their way, meeting with the Protestant pastor, they could not resist the temptation of feasting their barbarous eyes with a new kind of cruelty which had just suggested itself to the diabolical imagination of one of the soldiers. This was to strip the minister naked, and alternately to cover him with ice and burning coals. This novel mode of tormenting a fellow creature was immediately put into practice, and the unhappy victim expired beneath the torments which seemed to delight his inhuman prosecutors. This novel mode of tormenting a fellow creature was immediately put into practice, and the unhappy victim expired beneath the torments which seemed to delight his inhuman persecutors. A secret order was soon after issued by the emperor, for apprehending all noblemen and gentlemen who had been principally concerned in supporting the Protestant cause, and in nominating Frederick Elector Palatine of the Rhine to be king of Bohemia. These, to the number of 50, were apprehended in one night, and at 1 hour, and brought from the places where they were taken to the castle of Prague, and the estates of those who were absent from the kingdom were confiscated. Themselves were made outlaws, and their names fixed upon a gallows, as marks of public ignominy. The High Court of Reformers then proceeded to try the 50 who had been apprehended, and 2 apostate Protestants were appointed to examine them. These examinants asked a great number of unnecessary and impertinent questions, which so exasperated one of the noblemen, who was naturally of a warm temper, that he exclaimed, opening his breast at the same time, "Cut here, search my heart. You shall find nothing but the love of religion and liberty. Those were the motives for which I drew my sword, and for those I am willing to suffer death." As none of the prisoners would change their religion or acknowledge they had been in error, they were all pronounced guilty, but the sentence was referred to the emperor. When that monarch had read their names and an account of the respective accusations against him, he passed judgment on all, but in a different manner, as his sentences were of 4 kinds: death, banishment, imprisonment for life, and imprisonment during pleasure. 20 being ordered for execution were informed they might send for Jesuits, monks, or friars to prepare for the awful change they were to undergo, but that no Protestants should be permitted to come near them. This proposal they rejected, and strove all they could to comfort and cheer each other upon this solemn occasion. On the morning of the day appointed for the execution, a cannon was fired as a signal to bring the prisoners from the castle to the principal marketplace, in which scaffolds were erected and a body of troops were drawn up to attend the tragic scene. The prisoners left the castle with as much cheerfulness as if they had been going to an agreeable entertainment instead of a violent death. Exclusive of soldiers, Jesuits, priests, executioners, attendants, etc., a prodigious concourse of people attended to see the exit of these devoted martyrs, who were executed in the following order. Lord Shilluk was about 50 years of age, and was possessed of great natural and acquired abilities. When he was told he was to be quartered, and his parts scattered in different places, he smiled with great serenity, saying, quote, "The loss of a sepulchre is but a trifling consideration." End quote. A gentleman who stood by, crying, "Courage, my lord," he replied, "I have God's favor, which is sufficient to inspire anyone with courage. The fear of death does not trouble me. Formerly I have faced him in fields of battle to oppose Antichrist, and now dare face him on a scaffold for the sake of Christ." Having said a short prayer, he told the executioner he was ready. He cut off his right hand and his head, and then quartered him. His hand and his head were placed upon the high tower of Prague, and his quarters distributed in different parts of the city. I am now full of years and wish to lay down life, that I may not be a witness of further evils which are to attend my country. You have long thirsted for my blood. Take it, for God will be my avenger. Venerable heirs, the greater honor now attends ye. A crown of martyrdom is your portion. Then, laying down his head, it was severed from his body at one stroke, and placed upon a pole in a conspicuous part of the city. Lord Harrant was a man of good sense, great piety, and much experience gained by travel, as he visited the principal places in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Hence he was free from national prejudices and had collected much knowledge. The accusations against this nobleman were his being a Protestant, and having taken an oath of allegiance to Frederick, Elector Palatine of the Rhine, as King of Bohemia. When he came upon the scaffold, he said, "I have traveled through many countries and traversed various barbarous nations, yet never found so much cruelty as at home. I have escaped innumerable perils by both sea and land, and surmounted inconceivable difficulties, to suffer innocently in my native place. My blood is likewise sought by those for whom I and my forefathers have hazarded our estates. But Almighty God, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He then went to the block, kneeled down, and exclaimed with great energy, "Into thine hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. In thee have I always trusted. Receive me, therefore, my blessed Redeemer." The fatal stroke was then given, and a period put to the temporary pains of this life. Lord Frederick de Bille suffered as a Protestant, and a promoter of the late war. He met his fate with serenity, and only said he wished well to the friends whom he left behind, forgave the enemies who caused his death, denied the authority of the emperor in that country, acknowledged Frederick to be the only true king of Bohemia, and hoped for salvation in the merits of his blessed Redeemer. I was a few minutes since greatly discomposed, but now I feel my spirits revive. God be praised for affording me such comfort. Death no longer appears as the king of terrors, but seems to invite me to participate of some unknown joys. Kneeling before the block, he said, "Almighty God, to thee I commend my soul. Receive it for the sake of Christ, and admit it to the glory of thy presence." The executioner put this nobleman to considerable pain, by making several strokes before he severed the head from the body. The Earl of Virginia was distinguished for his superior abilities and unaffected piety. On the scaffold he said, "We who drew our swords fought only to preserve the liberties of the people, and to keep our consciences sacred. As we were overcome, I am better pleased at the sentence of death than if the emperors had given me life, for I find that it pleases God to have his truth defended, not by our swords, but by our blood." He then went boldly to the block, saying, I shall now be speedily with Christ, and received the crown of martyrdom with great courage. Sir Gaspar Caplitz was 86 years of age. When he came to the place of execution, he addressed the principal officer thus: Behold, a miserable ancient man, who hath often entreated God to take him out of this wicked world, but could not until now obtain his desire. For God reserved me until these years to be a spectacle to the world, and a sacrifice to himself. Therefore God's will be done. One of the officers told him, in consideration of his great age, that if he would only ask pardon, he would immediately receive it. Ask pardon, exclaimed he. I will ask pardon of God, whom I have frequently offended, but not of the emperor, to whom I never gave any offense. Should I sue for pardon, it might be justly suspected I had committed some crime for which I deserved this condemnation. As I die innocent and with a clear conscience, I would not be separated from this noble company of martyrs. So saying, he cheerfully resigned his neck to the block. Procopius Dorchesky on the scaffold said, We are now under the emperor's judgment, but in time he shall be judged, and we shall appear as witnesses against him. Then taking a gold medal from his neck, which was struck when the Elector Frederick was crowned King of Bohemia, he presented it to one of the officers at the same time, uttering these words: As a dying man, I request, if ever King Frederick is restored to the throne of Bohemia, that you will give him this medal. Tell him, for his sake I wore it until death, and that now I willingly lay down my life for God and my king. He cheerfully laid down his head and submitted to the fatal blow. Dionysius Servius was brought up a Roman Catholic, but had embraced the Reformed religion for some years. When upon the scaffold, the Jesuits used their utmost endeavors to make him recant and return to his former faith, but he paid not the least attention to their exhortations. Kneeling down, he said, They may destroy my body, but cannot injure my soul. That I commend to my Redeemer. And then patiently submitted to martyrdom, being at that time 56 years of age. Valentine Cochin was a person of considerable fortune and eminence, perfectly pious and honest, but of trifling abilities. Yet his imagination seemed to grow bright and his faculties to improve on death's approach, as if the impending danger refined the understanding. Just before he was beheaded, he expressed himself with such eloquence, energy, and precision as greatly amazed those who knew his former deficiency in point of capacity. Tobias Staffic was remarkable for his affability and serenity of temper. He was perfectly resigned to his fate, and a few minutes before his death spoke in this singular manner: I have received during the whole course of my life many favors from God. Ought I not therefore cheerfully to take one bitter cup when he thinks proper to present it? Or rather, ought I not rejoice that it is his will I should give up a corrupted life for that of immortality? Dr. Gesenius, an able student of physic, was accused of having spoken disrespectful words of the emperor, of treason in swearing allegiance to the Elector Frederick, and of heresy in being a Protestant. For the first accusation he had his tongue cut out, for the second he was beheaded, and for the third and last he was quartered, and the respective parts exposed on poles. Christopher Colbert, as soon as he stepped upon the scaffold, said, I come in the name of God to die for his glory. I have fought the good fight and finished my course. So, executioner, do your office. The executioner obeyed, and he instantly received the crown of martyrdom. No person ever lived more respected or died more lamented than John Schultes. The only words he spoke before receiving the fatal stroke were, The righteous seem to die in the eyes of fools, but they only go to rest. Lord Jesus, thou hast promised that those who come to thee shall not be cast off. Behold, I come. Look on me, pity me, pardon my sins, and receive my soul. Maximilian Hostialic was famed for his learning, piety, and humanity. When he first came on the scaffold, he seemed exceedingly terrified at the approach of death. The officer, taking notice of his agitation, Hostiliac said, Ah, sir, now the sins of my youth crowd upon my mind, but I hope God will enlighten me, lest I sleep the sleep of death, and lest mine enemies say we have prevailed. I hope my repentance is sincere, and will be accepted, in which case the blood of Christ will wash me from my crimes. He then told the officer he should repeat the song of Simeon, at the conclusion of which the executioner might do his duty. He accordingly said, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. At which words his head was struck off at one blow. When John KIII came to the place of execution, a Jesuit said to him, Embrace the Roman Catholic faith, which alone can save and arm you against the terrors of death. To which he replied, Your superstitious faith I abhor. It leads to perdition, and I wish for no other arms against the terrors of death than a good conscience. The Jesuit turned away, saying sarcastically, The Protestants are impenetrable rocks. You are mistaken, said KIII. It is Christ that is the rock, and we are firmly fixed upon him. This person, not being born independent, but having acquired a fortune by a mechanical employment, was ordered to be hanged. Just before he was turned off, he said, I die, not for having committed any crime, but for following the dictates of my own conscience and defending my country and religion. Simeon Zisca was a father-in-law to KIII, and like him was ordered to be executed on a gallows. He went cheerfully to death, and appeared impatient to be executed, saying, Every moment delays me from entering into the kingdom of Christ. Nathaniel Wadniansky was hanged for having supported the Protestant cause and the election of Frederick to the crown of Bohemia. At the gallows, the Jesuits did all in their power to induce him to renounce his faith. Finding their endeavors ineffectual, one of them said, If you will not adjure your heresy, at least repent of your rebellion. To which Wadniansky replied, You take away our lives under a pretended charge of rebellion, and not content with that, seek to destroy our souls. Glut yourselves with blood, and be satisfied, but tamper not with our consciences. Wadniansky's own son then approached the gallows and said to his father, Sir, if life should be offered to you on a condition of apostasy, I entreat you to remember Christ, and reject such pernicious overtures. To this the father replied, It is very acceptable, my son, to be exhorted to constancy by you, but suspect me not, rather endeavor to confirm in their faith your brothers, sisters, and children, and teach them to imitate the constancy of which I shall leave them an example. He had no sooner concluded these words than he was turned off, receiving the crown of martyrdom with great fortitude. Wenceslaus Gisbitsky, during his whole confinement, had great hopes of life given him, which made his friends fear for safety of his soul. He, however, continued steadfast in his faith, prayed fervently at the gallows, and met his fate with singular resignation. Martin Foster was an ancient cripple, the accusations against whom were being charitable to heretics and lending money to the Elector Frederick. His great wealth, however, seemed to have been his principal crime. That he might be plundered of his treasures was the occasion of his being ranked in this illustrious list of martyrs.